Hey guys, in this video we are going to talk about using the class ID and descendant selectors to be more specific with some of our styles now that you have the basic syntax down. In the document that I've added in the resources for the week, I encourage you to come down and read about the different types of selectors that are going to be even more specific than what I cover in the video. But just to get you started, we're going to be looking at some ways that you can be more specific. So I've taken my original basic web page, I've removed all of the styles. I have the same project open in Visual Studio Code, and the only method that I'm going to be using is the external method. I mentioned that this is the preferred way. All of your styles are going to be put externally on one page for organization and best practices. So again, if I refresh my page, there's no styles here, and we're going to be looking at different ways that's covered in the book for you to be using more specific selectors. So an easy way to start with, you'll notice that I have some notes here. There's two different attributes that we can add to any HTML element that's can be used then as what I refer to as a hook. It gives you something to attach to be more specific than just using the element by name. We've already looked at using an element by the name of it, but we've also discovered that when you have multiple elements, sometimes you don't want those styles to apply to everything. Classes and IDs can be used if you want elements in a specific area of a page to be different than other elements. So let's jump right in. First one is class attribute. We're going to add that to an element. We'll kind of see how that works. The important thing to know is that when you're calling that selector in your CSS, it has to start with a period. It's not over here on the HTML that it starts with a period. It's when you're using the selector in the CSS. And let me demonstrate. So I have an example down here on line 39 of a class attribute that's been added to this paragraph. So our previous examples, we've done it by type. So if I just put the P tag in here and I change the color to fuchsia and I do the semicolon and I save that, we know that it is going to apply to every paragraph on the page. But now that I have added a class attribute to this particular paragraph, we could simply use the class name. And let me show you how you would do that. So instead of the paragraph, we would remember it starts with a P, and what was it, recipe, I believe, was the class name. So the period, the class name, we save that, we come over here and refresh, and now it's specific to this. Now keep in mind, with classes, we can add the same class name to multiple areas on our page multiple times. With IDs, it's usually, or it is, by best practice, you only want one ID on a page. So you wouldn't, and the way I kind of remember that is an ID will give you a unique ID number, and that wouldn't be the same for multiple people. So that's kind of how I remember it. This also comes into play when you start doing things like with JavaScript or additional programming languages that need to perform a certain function using that ID. So you only want one to the page. So this example, an ID of home would only be specific to the home page. But what if we applied this same class to the article? So keep in mind that this is an example where this article, being a structural element, has multiple descendant elements inside of it. So if I apply that same class, and if I look at it, I've just at this point used just the class name, and it's going to apply to any element with that page. So if we look at what happens now, everything inside the article. Now, you might ask yourself, why would we then just target the paragraph? Well, if we want to just be specific just to the paragraph, we have to put that in our declaration here, in our syntax. So using our selector. And so if we want to target the element that has the actual class attached to it, that element needs to be attached on the left-hand side in this example. Okay, so if I were to save that, that's targeting only this paragraph with this class. And let's see how that changes our style. You can see that it's just that paragraph. Now, but we have that same class also given to the article. So let me show you what happens if I were to say, using it on the right-hand side of our selector. Instead of attaching them together, I'm going to call first the class, and then I'm going to do it based on what's called a descendant, or based on the relationship. So if it's on the right hand side and there's a space in between, I'm basically saying any element with this class that then has a paragraph inside, it's going to apply the fuchsia color to. So when I save that and I come over here and I refresh both paragraphs, if we look at the structure of our page, there's two paragraphs in here. Even though I've applied the class to only this one, the way that I'm setting up the selector in my CSS, whether it's more specific on the left just to the one paragraph with the class, or if I'm saying anything in any element, which is in this case the article, every paragraph. So that's something that takes a little getting used to, kind of a different concept, but it really works the same with IDs, except that we start our CSS rule with the pound sign. So in this case, we've given the main element the home, the name of home. So if I come up here under the ID example, I'm going to start my CSS declaration with the hashtag, and then the syntax is the exact same. So let's do something. I'm never creative with colors, but let's do purple. We'll save that. We'll update it, and really everything except what we've already put a specific declaration for the paragraphs, everything else is purple, and you can't really see that really greatly, but this heading up here, this heading up here, and so again it gives us an additional hook to do that. Now if we assign that ID, which we wouldn't in this case, the main element is really just a structural element that's meant to hold other elements. So it's the same concept down here. If we wanted to change this from and since we want the ID to be unique, I'm going to do a different ID name, but let's say, let me get my syntax correctly, the attribute name, and then we're going to give it a value of home2. That would not be a good naming practice, but just to illustrate, this is another way. This is specific just to a paragraph that doesn't have any other elements nested in it. Just like I had to put the paragraph on the left hand side up here, I would put the paragraph element on the left side up here, so it's only going to target that specific paragraph element with that ID. So if we look over here where we've done that, this paragraph down here, whoops, and it was home2 is why it didn't come through. So you notice you got to make sure, and that's a great example of how you troubleshoot these things. And now that paragraph with that home ID is purple. And so that's a good way to kind of distinguish between the two, but also to show relationships. So let's say we weren't even using the elements and tags. Let's take a look at, so I'm going to save this. I'm going to come over here. Let's comment these out. Let's go ahead. I'm going to select them. I'm going to hit the control and the question mark. I'm going to select each of these, and this is a good method while you're playing around. If you don't want to lose your whole code, you can just comment them out. If we go back and refresh, it takes them all away, but your code is still there. But I'm going to come down here by descendant, just by relationship. If we don't have any IDs assigned, we don't have any classes, the elements that we're going to refer to by relationship are the ones that are nested inside each other. So again, the navigation, the direct descendant would be the unordered list, and then additional descendants with each list item and each anchor tag. We also have in this ordered list down here with the list items for the recipe that we've looked at. Another example would be the article has the H2, the paragraphs, another section, all kinds of things nested inside. So let's go down to this aside element, and the aside, if you remember, is for a sidebar. So if I wanted to target something based on its relationship, you just list them in order from the highest, from the parent container element all the way down to however far deep in the relationship that you want to go. So in this instance, if I wanted to say only the H3 elements that are inside of or nested inside of an aside element, the way that I would list that in my code would be aside, the name of the element, a space, and then the selector that we're actually wanting to target. So keep in mind, the element that's listed on the far right, however many levels deep you go, the last one is the one you're actually targeting. So the aside, and then the H3. So let's just change that color to aqua, one of my favorite colors. We'll update this, and sure enough, it changes it. So that is an example based on relationship. And just keep in mind that the more levels deep that you go is the more specific that you're being. So if I were to say section, ordered list, and then list items, the way that that would look like is we'd start with the parent element. We'd go to ordered list and list item. Now you might want to say, why wouldn't we include the H3 here? The reason that you wouldn't is because these are siblings to each other. This ordered list is not nested inside the H3, therefore we don't need to include it in our line. We're just showing the relationship there. So this is the ordered list is the first direct descendant, and then the second would be the list item, and the last thing on our list on the right is what we're actually targeting. So if we were to type this H3 in there, which I don't even know if it would break it, it does break it. So that's not, wouldn't be the correct, because this really, by you saying this, you're saying that the list item is nested inside the H3, and it is not. And so that's really all you need to know at this point for class ID and descendants. These are the things that you're going to want to practice on CodePen this week. And once you get the basic syntax and the structure down for the rule, go crazy with it. Start looking at your page structure as you start creating more complicated pages with a lot of different content and multiple pages. These are going to become really important. An example of how you might use an ID that I mentioned is specific to each page. You're going to have styles between each page or on every page, such as I mentioned in the header, the footer, things like that. But the main element is an example where for an about page, it's going to look quite different than what you're going to have in the main content area on your home page. So by giving the home page or your index.html page a unique ID, when you go to organize your styles for the home page, if you ever need to use that hook to be more specific, you can just use that ID. And then you would give your about page, we would come in here to the main, and we would give it an ID of about, and so it makes it specific. You could even come up here and put it at the very top level for the body, in the body, so that you could really use the ID and then the element name nested inside of it by relationship to show a style just for this page. So don't worry if all of this doesn't make complete sense at this point, but this really should help get you started in what you want to be focusing on as you're learning. So as always, if you have any questions, let me know, but have a great rest of your week.